Inspector.
Good evening. I welcome you all to this instruction course of simplifying lasers for comprehensive ophthalmologists, tips and tricks. We have got a prolific speakers like Kamaljeet, who has got a vast experience of laser photocoagulations. Other speakers are Abhishek Sharan, Pranav Saluja, Manish Tandon, Vinod Kumar Singh, and Ashish Mitra. The aim of this very course is to make a general ophthalmologist well aware about the fact that a future burden of medical retina is likely to be there, and even if they are a general ophthalmologist, they can jolly well deal with medical retina at least, not the surgical retina. Just to give a brief history, how the laser photocoagulation came into the ophthalmologist, I'll just put slide to this. Just simplifying very quickly, the concept of ocular therapy, light was first came from Judd Nashotrat, who went up to the roof of his laboratories where he utilized the sun rays to treat the retinal melanoma. Thus, the genesis of photocoagulation came into a field of ophthalmology. But it has got a lot of limitations because the sunny weather is the requirement. If weather is not sunny, which is really, Europe is very fond of unpredictable weathers, so that was a total failure. We have seen a prototype on this. It has come with the Xenon Car photocoagulator, which we have used in our department, State Institute of Ophthalmology. Kamaljeet will bear me out in this. It was by the name of Clinitex. It was a portable type of unit, but having a limitation that only a direct ophthalmoscope was attached to it. However, the provision of indirect ophthalmoscope was likely to be incorporated, but because of the strong burn and infrared emission led to the instant retinal burn, it didn't become popular. The first very laser which was used in ophthalmology was a ruby crystal. Later on, the first medical laser was used by C. Zhuang way back 1963. Next. This is very important, how it developed, how we are going, how we are, new improvements are there. In 1975-71, neodymium lasers and krypton laser came into the existence. Next. The important discovery which was there, I was also involved way back in 1987, I was there in Massachusetts. This was a Carmen A. Puliofito in collaboration with Massachusetts Institute of Ophthalmology Technology, developed a semiconductor lasers, which was nothing but a prototype of a today's diode lasers. For first time was used for retinal photocoagulation, but abundant thinking in the line that mainly it was for choroidal lesions, because 80% of the diode lasers were absorbed by the choroid and only 20% was absorbed by the retina. So it was mainly thought to be used for the choroidal lesions, but later on further studies revealed that the whatever 80% is being absorbed by the choroid, the 50% of it is being taken back to the retina. Thus, it was equally important to be used for retinal disorders. So you can see the diode lasers does not require any hi-fi or bulky water cooling or air cooling system. Even no fan is required, and it was portable in nature. And thus, you can see that most of the endo lasers are diode lasers, which can be brought into the OT from your OPD clinics, can very well use for the laser photocoagulation. Next. This is just a descriptive or a physical more involvement, where they are mentioning that the krypton lasers has got a penetrability during the hemoglobins also. Nd:YAG is nothing but double frequency YAG is just a solid state type of lasers where it can emit the near green light, so it is useful for the retina. and dyed laser is the invisible lasers. The future direction where we are going as far the laser is concerned is the sub-threshold micropulse laser. The advantage that it is nothing but a 810 nanopulse where there is a on time which is where the laser is pumped into it, and there is a off time. Off time gives the cooling effect to the retina, so the collateral damages are less. But I think a lot more studies are required to be done. I think with this brief introduction about the development of the lasers in ophthalmology, I give mic to Professor Kamaljeet Singh. He will speak on laser photocoagulation. Dr. Professor Kamaljeet Singh. Kamaljeet, please. Dr. Kamaljeet. Non-audible.
सर आप क्लोज करिए अपनी शेयर करना
प्लीज. ओके, शेयर को क्लोज कर. Stop sharing. Just a moment.
So, good afternoon, everyone. We have all the speakers here, and Dr. Shrikant has already introduced the subject to all of you, and we are going to I think you all can see my slides. Is it visible? And am I audible?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, sir. So, as Dr. Shrikant sir has instructed me, I'm going to speak on diabetic retinopathy and how practically we are going to have some guidelines for our Indian patients, because there are so many guidelines available in the literature and people are following that, and it becomes very costly for our patient. So we have to think about this. Now, I read a ICO guideline of 2017 for diabetic eye care. In Europe, actually, initially it was ETDRS and DRS who gave us some guidelines, but those are sometimes very costly, and our further improvement has taken place in due course. So the European guideline says that, the ICO guideline rather, says that you have to divide your patient depending on what kind of settings you have. Like if you have high resource settings, then the treatment would become slightly different. And the high resource setting means that where you have good equipments available, all kinds of advanced or state-of-the-art screening is available, and management of diabetic retinopathy is done based on current evidence and whatever the clinical trials are there. In a place where you have low or oblique intermediate resource settings like we have in India, the essential of core to mid-level service for screening and management of diabetic retinopathy differs in the sense that we have to consider the availability and access to care in different settings. Like in India, we don't have all kinds of OCTs available. There could be at some places laser available, and at some places even laser is not available. The fundus camera is also not available. So those kind of problems are there in India. In Allahabad, we have some very good setups. And in our department, we have all kinds of lasers and we have OCTs also. Now we have acquired OCT angiography also in the department. But this is a very place where high resource settings are there. But in periphery where these settings are not available, there you are in problem. So what you have to do is that the classification is also slightly different in this. In mild NPDR, you simply see the microaneurysms. In moderate NPDR, you see microaneurysms and other signs like dot and blot hemorrhages, hard exudates, and cotton wool spots. But they are less than severe NPDR. So that kind of situation is there. In severe NPDR, we have a lot of intraretinal hemorrhages in all the quadrants. and there could be definite venous bleeding in more than 2 quadrants. Then there could be intraretinal microvascular abnormalities in 1 quadrant. And you should be able to see with your fundus camera or with your indirect ophthalmoscopy and 70 diopter examination that there are no just 1 quadrant is having intraretinal microvascular abnormalities, but there should not be any PDR. And proliferative diabetic retinopathy, you all know, is PDR where neovascularization is there. You should have all the fundus camera and laser photocoagulation available with you. These are some of the examples given in the ICO guidelines. These are not my photographs, but here you can see that in some places you will have only just a little bit of macular edema. And macular edema is a portion wherein you cannot see the capillary details there. That is called macular edema or thickening. The previous definition of ETDRS of 500 micron and all those things are gone here. You have central involving diabetic maculopathy, macula involving maculopathy, or beyond 1 disk diameter of the macula that gets involved. Then you have some dot hemorrhages also and microaneurysms. So this could be considered in a mild kind of edema. And so macular edema, as I said, that it could be a non-central diabetic macular edema where the thickening does not involve the central subfluid zone in the 1 millimeter area of the macula. And a place where the central one is there, this is involved. So that is one which you can consider as clinically significant macular edema and immediately think of treating the disease. Then again, you have this kind of macular edema and hard exudates that are there within 1 disk diameter area. And then there are these changes of non-proliferative variety. You can see blot hemorrhages are there. Some hard exudates, the ring is also found here. There's another ring in the periphery, so NPDR is also there. And so these kind of changes you have to look for, since this course involves the comprehensive ophthalmologist. So you have to think of treating like this. And there could be another scenario where you have so much of hard exudates in the macular area, diffuse kind of macular edema is there. And then you can have in the peripheral area, you can have cotton wool spots. These retinal hemorrhages could be there, blot hemorrhages could be there, and you can see there are so many hemorrhages. So you can easily put this, and there is no neovascularization anywhere. So you can put this in severe NPDR. So the treatment would differ here. Another case where you have severe NPDR, and you can see these new vessels are formed, and venous bleeding is also there. There is this kind of hemorrhage is also there. And in the macular area, you can see some hemorrhages and thickening is also there. There are soft exudates here. So this is PDR having big problem in this case. And another case where you can see new vessels on the disc and pre-retinal hemorrhage, which is boat shaped. So this is PDR with high risk characteristics. If you get this kind of picture, you have to immediately jump to pan-retinal photocoagulation without bothering much, and no other investigation should be done, or you can give a intravitreal injection, and along with this, you can do a pan-retinal photocoagulation and do a OCT and look for macular edema. So that will help you in diagnosing the disease and treating this patient. Another case of PDR with high risk characteristics, you can see these fibrous bands have formed and new vessels is there. Then there is a pre-retinal hemorrhage here also, other hemorrhages are there. So this is also PDR with high risk characteristics. Here, when you get a fibrous tissues, then PRP should be done very carefully if you do, but best is to refer this patient to a person who is doing a vitreoretinal surgery, who will manage this in a better way. But one injection of anti-VEGF would help this patient. So in high resource setting, what you have to do in diabetic retinopathy is that if there is no diabetic retinopathy, in 1 to 2 years, you have to re-examine the patient. Mild to moderate, this thing you have to examine within 3 to 6 months. That you have to do in Indian setting. In Indian setting, the frequency of examination should be more, because diabetes is usually uncontrolled. and you are unable to treat these patients. In severe NPDR, you reduce the follow-up, the time of the follow-up much less. And you can even do in Indian setup, what I do is, because these patients don't come up for follow-up regularly, so it is better to do a early PRP in these cases, because if the patient comes to you with vitreous hemorrhage, then you are in trouble. So these kind of protocol should be followed, and uh, so these things have to be. Now, if the non-central involving diabetic macular edema is there, then you have to follow up these patients regularly in high resource settings. When in a low resource setting like us, I would say that you do a focal laser photocoagulation. That means that you have to laser the microaneurysm, so that should be done. If it is central involved, then you, of course, you do anti-VEGF therapy with focal laser in low resource setup, and you give anti-VEGF injection after getting a OCT done, and that can be done. And after 3 to 6 months, you have to check this patient whether the diabetic macular has edema has stabilized or not. So that sort of thing is there. So these are some of the things that you have to do. An OCT everybody should have. These days I find that general ophthalmology having this. Excuse me, I have two talks simultaneously. The coordinator, please look at this. I have two talks simultaneously. Dr. Manish Tandon is not coming, so I'll take some more time. Thank you. So here you have OCT, which is most sensitive method for diabetic macular edema, and you do OCT for macula and look for whether there is any traction present there or not. So you look, this is almost normal OCT where the contour is normal and everything, little bit of fluid is there. But here you can see there is so much of fluid there, and there is little bit of these changes are also there. In this, the edema is marked, and here in this case, you can see there is vitreous traction. So the management would differ. Like in low setting like ours, here nothing is to be done. Here you can give anti-VEGF and simultaneously you can do a focal laser, so that it becomes almost a final treatment for the patient. Although the recommendations are that you keep on giving anti-VEGF injections regularly and see that this edema subsides. But in our setup, if once we give anti-VEGF costing around 20,000, many patients don't come up. Some patients come, those who are having good socioeconomic status, they might come, but others don't come. Here in this case of vitreoretinal traction in the macula, there you have to resort to surgery. The laser or injection would not help much. So this thing has to be taken care of in macular edema. So FFA, sometimes these days the incidence of FFA has reduced because of the availability of OCT, but you need to do FFA in almost all the cases where renal insufficiency is not there, and you have to look for any non-perfused areas and neovascularizations. So these things have to be looked into this, and microaneurysms can be better visualized by doing angiography, and plus the ischemic macula that you can know. Now, in this case, angiography has been done. You can see the leak is so much, and there are some microaneurysms here. This pre-retinal hemorrhage is also there. Here, you continue doing PRP and anti-VEGF injections, and do a lot of PRP in these cases to see that this neovascularization subsides. So that can be done. A PRP looks like this. You have to give lots of shots, around 1500 to 2000 in all the quadrants up to the equator, and then again do FFA or OCT, etc. repeatedly. But FFA is done after 3 to 6 months, when you will find that the neovascularization has subsided and regressed. So that can be done. So follow-up is very, very important in these patients. In Indian setup, what happens, that patient comes to you and you call them again, they don't come. So many a time they come back with vitreous hemorrhage and they say that the treatment was not proper. So these kind of thing has to be. So PDR, you have to do PRP. Anti-VEGF injections are important. Other costly anti-VEGFs are also available. But Indian scenario, as I've said, the compliance is poor and follow-up is poor, patients are poor. So you immediately give one injection and then do PRP. Okay, so these are the things in Indian scene that you have to take care of. In high resource settings, you have to follow the protocol. You have to first control the diabetes properly and then start doing almost the same treatment, whether the central macula is involved or not. Depending on that, you will give injections or not. If you are going a combined treatment of anti-VEGF and laser photocoagulation, then don't go close to 500 micron in the macular area. Otherwise, you can cause problem and the vision would go down. So the present day regime is injection, and you continue doing this. In Indian scenario, monthly injections followed by treatment interruption, as I have already said, is very good. And majority of our patients will settle if you do a combined anti-VEGF and laser photocoagulation, so that can be done. In high resource settings, you can continue with intravitreal anti-VEGF injections if diabetic macular edema is there. And as so, ETR all have said that we have to manage it like this. So with this, I would just stop here. Have high socioeconomic strata like this. These are very little percentage. And here you would find that a poor patient comes to us, we have to manage accordingly. So these are some of my thoughts which you have to take care of. And times loan is also a very good thing that you can give.
I'm
In
really
macular
sorry to
edema,
interrupt,
you
sir,
will
but time निकल चुका है,
so
and we
my
have
time
to
is up.
manage time.
I'll stop here and I'll stop sharing and I'll invite Dr. Abhishek Saran for the next talk.
Thank you, sir. Sorry for the inconvenience.
No,
Sorry.
no, fine. Thank you. Dr. Abhishek Saran, you can.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. I'll be sharing my slides. Are my slides visible?
Not yet. Yes, they are visible now.
Okay. And I'm audible?
Yes, very loud and clear. You can get started, sir. Your time has started.
Right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, AIOS, and thank you, Professor Kamaljit sir and Shrikant sir, for giving me this opportunity for this instruction course. I'll be talking on CRVO and HRVO, central retinal vein occlusion and hemiretinal vein occlusion, and the role of laser in these patients. So starting central retinal vein occlusion, we know that is a occlusion of the main retinal vein posterior to the lamina crabrosa of the optic nerve, and a hemiretinal vein occlusion occurs in patients who have two trunks of the central retinal vein which has bifurcated much before the lamina crabrosa. So CRVO will present in our clinic with a sudden painless loss of vision with RAPD may or may not be present. Disc swelling is there, dilated tortuous veins are there, dense hemorrhages are there, and macular edema is there, which is the main cause of vision blurring initially. The ischemic or the hemorrhagic retinopathy or the ischemic CRVO, clinically you can know that it's a ischemic one by the poor visual acuity, which may be less than 6/60, RAPD in the affected eye, then very dense hemorrhages with multiple cotton wool spots. And if we do a angiography, it will be more than 10 disc areas of the CNP areas. The non-ischemic or the venous stasis retinopathy will have lesser hemorrhages, will not have a RAPD, and similarly the vision will be better, the macular edema will be less severe. So all these conditions will give you a hint that this one is a non-ischemic one. Even if we see a non-ischemic CRVO, we have to be careful because these eyes will may convert into ischemic CRVO, and this may happen into 30% of the cases over a period of 3 years. In our clinic, when a patient comes, we will do an OCT initially to see the macular edema because the cause of vision loss is mainly macular edema. And we would like to know the severity of the macular edema and hence accordingly decide about the injections. Injections we know is the first line of treatment these days. But right now we are talking about lasers, so I'll be concentrating more on lasers. But the the OCT has become a very important tool for us in the OPD to find out what the prognosis of the case is, because the integrity of the ellipsoid zone and the photoreceptor layer can give you big hints on how the patient will respond to the anti-VEGF therapy. And also subsequently response of treatment can be seen on the OCT. The systemic workup on the first visit of the patient in the clinic is very important. CRVO, as we know, happens to most elderly individuals more than 60 years of age who are already comorbid with diabetes or hypertension. So we would not worry too much about them, investigating them too much, but we would like to do some further investigations in young patients less than 50 years of age who are presenting with a CRVO. It might be non-ischemic or ischemic, it doesn't matter. But we would like to rule out hematological disorders, infectious diseases, hyperlipidemia, vasculitis, and many other. So diabetes and hypertension also in young patients, sometimes the patient will present and it will be the first time they will be discovering that they have the disease. Also, ocular associations with CRVO are there. We know that primary open angle glaucoma is associated with the CRVO, and sometimes the patients are diagnosed with glaucoma when they present with the CRVO. Pseudoexfoliation, optic nerve head drusen. This is a beautiful picture of both the eyes having an optic disc drusen, where the right eye has ended up with a CRVO. Also hypermetropia and orbital disease, which can put some compression retroorbitally and cause a CRVO. So talking about the landmark study that we had, the central vein occlusion study, they gave us the landmark questions were answered by this study as to when the macular edema has to be treated, whether to be treated or not treated, and then the ischemic CRVO, what kind of a pan-retinal photocoagulation is to be done, and when it is to be done, whether we wait for the neovascularization of the iris to come or whether we do it before. So the groups were assigned and subsequently results were given, and we will be talking about them as we go further in the presentation. Talking about the macular edema first, we want to know that macular edema was the main cause of vision loss initially when a patient presented with the acute CRVO. So corticosteroids were tried and they were very successful initially, reducing the macular edema and increasing the vision. So the SCORE trial, the Geneva trial, all these were done, and it had very good results. Evaluation of the grid pattern photocoagulation for macular edema and central vein occlusion did not support or recommend a macular grid photocoagulation, because the patients who underwent photocoagulation and those who did not undergo any treatment, the visual acuity difference at the end was not significant, and therefore it was said that grid photocoagulation for the macular edema is not advised. The anti-VEGF intravitreal therapy of ranibizumab, aflibercept, bevacizumab are the currently main line of treatment in the macular edema, and there have been so many studies being going on, and they are in the course also, that have time and again told us that they are very effective treatments for the macular edema. Coming on to the angiography in CRVO, which becomes a very important tool in finding out if it is a ischemic or a non-ischemic CRVO, and therefore the delayed arm to retina time, prolonged AV transit, capillary dropouts, and extent of the CNP areas are the most likely things that we want to know on an FFA, so that we can find out if it is a ischemic CRVO or not. So early phase FFA is not very informative in the sense that we don't see CNP areas clearly because of the hemorrhages, and the disc leaks make them hazy. In the late phase, after 2 or 3 months, when you do a FFA, you can clearly see the CNP areas. So if the CNP areas are more than 30 disc diameters, it becomes borderline, and we need to do a PRP. In our Indian settings, we follow up the patient closely and do regular monitoring to see for NVI and NVA. Although in an Indian scenario, if you have extensive CNP areas on angiography, you right away go for a pan-retinal photocoagulation and do not wait for a NVI or a NVA, because we know that sometimes the patient lose follow-up, and when they come back, they have an extensive neovascular glaucoma, and then intervening becomes very difficult, and you can't do very effective pan-retinal photocoagulation. So once you have the time and you see CNP areas that are extensive, then you should immediately go for a PRP with multiple settings and settle the disease then and there. Doing a gonioscopy at every follow-up is very important, because some patients with FFA they can't afford, or you can't see many ischemic areas. Gonioscopy is a very good tool. I'll just take 2 minutes. Gonioscopy is a very effective tool, and the new vessels regress as soon as the PRP is initiated. So the pan-retinal photocoagulation is done in multiple settings with the sophisticated green and yellow lasers that are there now. And the CVOS study suggested that just a minute, sir, just a minute.
Sum up.
Yeah,
I think
initially the
better sum up,
CVOS
because one
study.
should stick to the time.
Coordinator, we have lot of time here because we have panel discussion. So let them continue for 1 or 2 minutes, please.
So the
Coordinator,
CVOS study, thank you, sir. Thank you. The CVOS studies said that the pan-retinal photocoagulation should be done only when you have an NVI and an NVA. But further down the lane, many studies were done, and a study by Lee et al., it was a review of literature basically, where he did a systematic review of all the studies that have been done on pan-retinal photocoagulation for ischemic CRVO, and he looked into all the complications of the neovessels of the retina, disc, iris, angle, and the vitreous hemorrhage, changes in visual acuity, macular thickness, and intraocular pressure were considered. And he was of the opinion, after reviewing everything, that laser photocoagulation did not appear to increase the vision of the patient, but it did prevent significantly the complications of the cases that were subjected to ischemia. So virtually all the complications of neovascular glaucoma were eliminated by doing PRP early, and laser photocoagulation also increased the retinal blood flow in eyes with ischemic CRVO. So all in all, with all the review of literature and this systematic review, we should do pan-retinal photocoagulation as soon as we are sure that the patient has a ischemic CRVO. Initiating it prevents a lot of complications of neovascular glaucoma and fields restrictions and all that. So I would like everybody to take this point from this presentation, that the PRP is important to be done at the right time. And with the anti-VEGFs for macular edema, I don't think right now we should be going for grid macular photocoagulation. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Abhishek. Thank you, Dr. Abhishek. Kamaljeet, should I invite Dr. Pranav Saluja in continuity with this very topic?
Yes,
Yes, sir, sure.
It is my proud privilege to now invite. Now, Abhishek has very well covered the central retinal vein occlusion. In continuity with this, now it is my proud privilege to call upon no one less than Pranav Saluja. He is really a bright child, doing very good work under the guidance of Dr. Kamaljeet Singh. He will be talking about BRVO and laser photocoagulation. Dr. Pranav Saluja, please.
Thank you so much, sir. Is my screen visible?
Yeah. Wonderful.
Okay, I'll start with. Yes. So I'll be talking about branch retinal vein occlusion, the studies and protocols. I'll be brief because of the lack of time right now. So mainly BRVO, the prevalence is around 4.42 per 1,000. And it can be further classified as major BRVO, which is an occlusion of a retinal vein that drains one of the quadrants, or either macular BRVO, which is an occlusion of a venule within the macula. So the common sites of retinal vein occlusion, this is the point at which usually the central retinal vein exits the eye, and this is a common site for CRVO, while an AV crossing is the site where a typical BRVO occurs. So the causes of vision loss in BRVO are macular edema. We can see that multiple cysts are present in the OCT. This is an inferotemporal BRVO, as we can see that on the inferior side of the macula, we can see that there is edema, while on the superior side it is not. So by a raster scan, we can easily see that it is mostly on the inferior side. Then there is intraretinal hemorrhage, which can block, which is giving blocked fluorescence in FFA, as we can see in the mid phase. The other causes may be ischemia and neovascularization, and this is very important to be seen in cases of BRVO. In this picture, we can see that there is a superior ischemia and neovascularization on the disc can be seen with the leakage. This is another photo which is depicting capillary dropout areas on the superiotemporal quadrant. So BRVO can be ischemic or non-ischemic, and we should always keep it in mind. Branch vein occlusion study gave a definition of greater than 5 disc diameters of non-perfusion for neovascularization to develop, while in Vibrant study, which was a comparison between aflibercept and grid laser, they gave greater than 10 disc areas of non-perfusion as the definition. So the pathogenesis is mainly it occurs at the AV crossings where thick-walled arteries compress and obstruct adjacent thin-walled veins. And these follow the principles of Virchow's triad for intravascular thrombus formation. So the complications, as we talked about, is neovascularization, which is the development of fragile new vessels prone to hemorrhage. And they develop in ischemic BRVO only and can occur years after the onset. The other thing is vitreous hemorrhage can occur as a complication. This is mainly after neovascularization. In long-standing cases, as we can see that there are multiple capillary dropout areas, capillary non-perfusion areas, and neovascularization can be seen with the leakage on the FFAs. So the treatment mainly focuses on the reducing the macular edema, preventing the neovascularization, and treating neovascularization to reduce risk of vitreous hemorrhage. So the main study that was done for BRVO was BVOS, and it set out to answer 3 questions on the effectiveness of laser. Whether scatter laser photocoagulation prevents the development of neovascularization or vitreous hemorrhage, and can macular grid laser photocoagulation improve visual acuity in eyes with severe vision degradation due to macular edema. So it was a multi-centric prospective RCT. I'll be taking through the first arm, which was sector laser photocoagulation versus no laser for ischemic and non-ischemic BRVO for prevention of neovascular development. So the conclusion was that they found that the visual acuity gain was around 2 lines of visual acuity in cases where we did grid laser, and in which we did not, there was lower visual acuity present. And the photocoagulation reduces occurrence of vitreous hemorrhage, and sector laser treatment is recommended once neovascularization develops. So this was seen that the vision was greater than 20/40 in where laser treatment was given in 60% of the patients as compared to 34 patients. So the other study was co-trial. This was also a multicentric prospective RCT, and it compared IV intravitreal triamcinolone with grid pattern lasers. And they found that there was no significant difference between the treatment groups when comparing the visual acuity improvement, and corticosteroid featured a worse side effect profile. So they said that grid laser was better. It was better to do grid laser rather than giving triamcinolone in these cases because higher adverse event rates were seen. So I'll come on to sectoral scatter photocoagulation. It is indicated when there is mainly treating the ischemic complications, which are rubeosis and retinal neovascularization. So the mechanism is that it reduces oxygen demand by destroying the photoreceptors within the retina, and hypoxia is corrected and production of cytokines is normalized. So the technique is the laser is directed at the quadrant of ischemia, and this is seen with the help of fundus fluorescein angiography. And we should always avoid the areas of intraretinal hemorrhage. So this is how we do the laser, and BVOS found that doing scatter photocoagulation did reduce neovascularization and vitreous hemorrhage cases. So the parameters are 200 to 500 μm size, and 0.1 to 0.2 second duration is taken. We do a medium white burns, and the laser spots are applied around the posterior pole extending anterior to the equator on the ischemic areas. So these are done one burn apart, as we can see, and proper spaced burns should be given, and a total of around 1200 to 2005 spots are done. So the complications that can occur are choroidal hemorrhage and choroidal effusion if we do more amount of lasers is done. And there can be accidental burn to the fovea also. So we should be aware of this and prevent it, because the patient may be blind because of that. Macular edema may occur after laser. So if the patient already has macular edema, it is better to treat him with the help of anti-VEGF and then go for a PRP or scatter laser photocoagulation. And then we follow up the patient every 4 months, and FFA is a must in a first follow-up, because we can see what areas we've left and we can go for a FFA guided laser if neovascularization persists. So CWAS said that we should apply retinal photocoagulation only in active neovascularization, and not like if we have capillary non-perfusion areas, that does not indicate for us to go for a scatter laser. We should always go when there is neovascularization in these cases, and this was seen in cases of in these studies. Then there is indications of macular grid laser. This will be later covered by Dr. Vinod sir. So I'll just go through it briefly. It is mainly done in cases of BRVO for a duration of at least, if there has been already BRVO for 3 months, because we need the hemorrhages to resolve so that we can do a proper laser there. The visual acuity should be less than 612, then only we should go for macular grid laser. And macular hemorrhage, as we've talked about, should not be present. And the main thing is that perfusion should be present. So FFA should be done for macular grid laser, because whenever we should only laser when there is perfused macula and not in cases where there is macular ischemia. That is a contraindication for grid laser photocoagulation. And mainly the mechanism is that it improves the tight junctions of the RP, and this efficacy was demonstrated by VWAS. The grid is applied across the macula, avoiding the fovea, and we apply 50 to 100 μm spot size, and this is guided by FFA. So FFA is very important in these cases to find out whether the macula is ischemic or not. So VWAS found significant improvement with grid laser photocoagulation. The contraindications, as I've talked about, macular ischemia is absolute contraindication for grid laser. Laser should not be applied over areas of hemorrhages, because it gives intense pigmentation, and that could cause photocoagulation of the photoreceptors. So there are multiple different type of lasers, like conventional laser and micropulse laser. And micropulse mainly gives bursts of pulses, and thus barely visible burns are made, and we can prevent the damage to the photoreceptors. And it also reduces macular edema in these cases. So grid laser will be covered by sir, so I won't be going into it deeply. There is also a subthreshold laser that we are using these days. Micropulse 810 nm laser is done. The mechanism is to deliver more energy to the RP cells without the collateral damage to the neurosensory retina. And the laser energy is given in pulses, as Shrikant sir has already explained. And this may be as effective as conventional therapy without visible burns. So that is it. Thank you.
Dr. Kamalji,
Yes, sir.
यार वो मनीष is not there ना, I think.
मनीष का हमने कवर कर लिया है सर.
कर लिया ना? So I think straight away I go for.
Yes, sir.
I'll just take few, because already Professor Kamalji, Dr. Pranav and Abhishek Sanan are taking care. I'll be just talking about follow-up of the patient. That is also important in Indian scenario, that how, when we call these patients, and what are the criteria of calling these patients back, because many patients don't turn up. For follow-up, please, or they cannot afford to come down for follow-up, please. Not as if they don't want to come up. Next, please. As we have already covered the focal and scattered laser photocoagulation, so my talk will be more specific for two things. One is focal laser photocoagulation, another is for scatter laser photocoagulation. Once we are doing a focal photocoagulation for diabetic macular edema, the possible transient initial decrease in the central vision is very important parameter. The paracentral scotoma laser burn have been placed very close to fovea. In such a case, the permanent central scotoma may be there. So we must look for a follow-up patients for these things, the permanent of central scotomas, and we should avoid inadvertent any foveal burn near to, because once we go very nearer to the retina, that should be. And I think micro or sub-threshold micropulse laser will be an answer for treating this, where the chances of collateral damage is minimal. Thus, we can save the macula and avoid inadvertent damage to the macula. Once we are doing a pan-retinal photocoagulation, again, because we are doing the pan-retinal photocoagulation, the patient may develop macular edema. So it is advisable to, in a follow-up, instead of going in a one go, it should be done in a 2 to 3 sittings, or maybe preferably 4 sittings, so as to avoid the macular edema, because the patients come with a good vision or with reasonably good vision will end up into a very poor vision because of the macular edema, post-laser macular edema. Peripheral field constrictions occurs due to pan-retinal photocoagulation, and it is leading to delay dark adaptation. Vitreous hemorrhage, if neovascularization is present, it is a matter of concern. And nowadays, with the advent of other people are more proficient as far as doing the surgical procedures. Otherwise, there was a term being coined in a case where a vitreous hemorrhage has occurred. In case of doing pan-retinal photocoagulation, the term is called a visible laser photocoagulation, meaning thereby you are doing the laser photocoagulation wherever the retina is visible, and wherever the retina you cannot see because of the hemorrhage, retinal or vitreous hemorrhage, you forget, you don't do it, because the next sitting maybe that vitreous hemorrhage or retinal hemorrhage will resolve, and patient will be much benefited and does not require any vitrectomy procedures to be done. As it has been mentioned, it will be reduced accommodation and mydriasis will be there in these patients. More important, before coming to the follow-up is how to monitor it, because we should have a proper record so that we know that in this area, say first sitting, second sitting, third sittings are being done. So the keeping the record is very important, and monitoring of IOP is also important, because sometimes if we are doing extensive hemorrhage, there is an increase of intraocular tension as well. So not as if the patient landed into the glaucoma. Record keeping, as we are doing conventional record retinal detachment charts are there. Likewise, ROP chart is there, retinopathy of prematurity, where we are using a diode lasers to do it, because the record keeping is very, very important, so that you know that this area is there. I have come through one of the things where you can keep the records, and instead of mentioning and 1, 2, 3, because many times the patients get worried about that what is 1, what is 2, it is that it can be denominated as a alpha, beta, gamma, theta, and epsilon. That denominations are as for the number of laser procedures being done or laser sittings being done. So a surgeon comes to know better. Instead, that patient is worried about that this much laser is being done. Instead of putting a 1, 2, 3, it can be put into a Latin word like alpha, beta, gamma, theta, delta, and epsilon, and so on. The very important aspect, as mentioned, that our aim is of the laser in the case of diabetic retinopathy or BRVO or CRVO is to achieve the end stage. What is exactly the end stage, or how the laser helps? Laser will be showing the regression of the disease process by blunting the vessel tips, shrinking and disappearing of the new vascularizations. It will often leaving as a gauze vessels, regression of intraretinal microembryos, decreased venous changes, absorption. As I have already mentioned this many times, after doing laser photocoagulation, retinal hemorrhages or vitreous hemorrhages get absorbed. Contraction of regression of the vessels associated with vitreous separation can precipitate the vitreous hemorrhage, because the vitreous separation can put a pull on the vitreous cavity, can lead to vitreous hemorrhage. Patient should remain under observations, because many times the recurrence can occur So additional or more or filling up of the PRP is required in these patients. So it is important to note these findings as far as your chart is concerned, these findings in follow-up, please, so that you can achieve the end stage. The review is depending, what exactly the ending review is depending upon the severity of proliferative diabetic retinopathies, requirement of the successive treatment, application of initial treatment should be fractioned as I mentioned 2 to 3 sessions or even 4 sessions or so, looking into whether you are not causing iatrogenic macular edema. Once adequate number of bonds is there, then in these cases, patient can be required to see after 4 to 6 weeks or even after 3 months with the perfect control of this. With this, I think a strict follow-up record keeping is also very important. No doubt, undoubtedly, a good laser is a requirement of a diabetic retinopathy of a CRVO or BRVO case wherever you are required to be done. But a proper record keeping and follow-up is also equally important. With this comment, I finish up my talk. Thank you, Dr. Kamalji.
Sir,
Yeah.
for a wonderful lecture. And you can invite the next speaker, sir. We'll have the
Okay.
questions in the end, sir.
Yes, yes. Now, last but not the least, I think Ashish Mitra is there, but otherwise Dr. Vinod Singh is there. He is a budding vitreoretinal surgeon. He is a budding vitreoretinal surgeon from my alma mater, that is MDI Hospital, Allahabad, under the guidance of Professor F.C. Singh and Professor Kamalji Singh. Dr. Vinod Singh, please.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Professor Srikanth sir, Kamalji sir, and AIS for giving me this opportunity to present for them. Just I will share my screen.
नहीं है क्या sir?
आपका यहाँ का है
ये यहाँ
My screens are visible.
yes, yes.
Okay, sir. So I will be just covering the points about how to perform the focal and grid laser and when to perform it. What are the indications and what are the different settings? We start with for the beginners at least. So the goal of a treatment in the macular photocoagulation is mainly we have to save the photoreceptors and the RPE cell from being damaged so as to prevent the vision. So the photocoagulation, what does it do? It just creates hyperthermia in the RPE cells, and in terms due to this hyperthermia, there is a production of the chemical mediators that contribute to the resolution of the macular edema, namely the PEDM, without induction of any lethal damage to the surrounding tissue. So focal treatment for leaking macular edema is combined if there is indication on fluorescein angiogram. So the next question is when should we plan for the next treatment? The second setting is required or not? If required, that should be considered at least 3 months after the initial setting we have done if required, detected by your fluorescein angiography. Otherwise, we should not do before 3 months. And here the papillomacular bundle is only allowed to treat when it is edema is more than 500 micron from the disc and also from the fovea. Within 500 diameter from the center of the macula, we should not treat the papillomacular bundle. So, how do we know that we have performed the focal grid laser? It is adequate, it has worked or not? These few points we can see after 3 months or 4 months of the laser. You will see there is a obliteration of the maculovascular lesions. There is a reduction in the macular edema. There is absorption of the hard exudates, and stabilization and improvement in the visual clarity can be seen very nicely if you have done the correct pattern. We have followed the protocols and the settings we have followed. You will get such pictures. Before laser, you can see a lot of hard exudates are there in the macular area, and after 3 to 4 months, there is a significant decrease in the number of the hard exudates and even the red dots in between the hard exudates. physiology about how the macular edema is occurring. There are two types of the macular edema you can notice. One is the focal macular edema due to the focal leakage, and another is the diffuse macular edema. The focal edema is due to the leaking microaneurysm, and diffuse retinal thickening is caused by usually a generalized breakdown of inner blood retinal barrier, that is leaking microaneurysms and edemas and short capillary segments are here. What is happening here? There is a accumulation of the protein in the extracellular compartment that is leading to the increase in oncotic pressure. As this increase in the oncotic pressure creates the, it draws the fluid from the retinal capillaries to the inner retina, and the swelling is there due to this oncotic pressure and protein accumulation. So, what is the effect? How does this photocoagulation helps in the, how it reduces the macular edema? Yes, the physiology, like there is improvement in the inner blood retinal barrier function. There is a remodeling of the RP, and there is a better oxygenation. Choroidal oxygen base is improved. When PRP is added to the ischemic area, there is a decreased consumption of the oxygen by the RP and photoreceptor, and thus leading to the reduction of the vascular caliber of the retinal blood vessels, and which promotes the reduction in the diabetic macular edema, and thus promoting the neuroprotection. So there are the two important tools which are very important before you proceed with the focal or grid laser, any even the PRP. The first most important is the FFA. It's help you to localize the foveal center, especially in the cases of the macular edema, where you are not able to localize the exact location of the fovea. It is very important, otherwise whole vision will be lost if you hit the fovea. And we have to see the FAZ. Do not cross inside the FAZ. So these two very important points that you can be recognized very accurately with the FFA only. And another important things you get from the FFA is leaking area and the retinal thickening. Like here you can see the microaneurysm with the fuzzy margins in the late phases. A lot of microaneurysm outside the FAZ here, and multiple microaneurysms here also with the leaking in the late phases, which are sometimes missed in the naked eye. You cannot see all the microaneurysms. So FFA is a good guide to see all the leaking and non-leaking microaneurysms. So another important tool is the OCT. OCT helps you in two ways. Gives you the quantitative analysis of the retinal thickness, pre-treatment and post-treatment, and your follow-up of the laser. You can see, like before laser, there were a lot of cystoid spaces, and after 4 months of the laser, there is a significant reduction in the cystoid spaces, and there is improvement in the vision also. So it helps you, follow up, and you can also show to your patients. Here the few gradings for the focal and grid laser. We should only give a very light burn, that is only faint white or mild hazy, that is very barely visible, that is blanching of retinal pigment cilium only. For PRP, you go for the grade 3 and grade 4 laser. There is a dense white or dirty moderate white coagulation should be there for the PRP, but for the focal and grid, mild hazy faint white coagulation should be visible only. So different pattern or different technique what we follow for the laser for the macular edema, like grid laser, focal laser, modified grid, that is grid plus focal, and the new one is the millipulse and the micropulse laser treatment. Now come to see what are the indication and how do we do focal laser. The first thing is the focal leakage are discrete points of retinal hyperfluorescence 500 microns from the macular center, which are causing the hard exudates and retinal thickening. Those leaking points should be considered for the focal leakage. Are within 300 to 500 micron of the leaking macroaneurysm, which are responsible for the hard exudates and retinal thickening, should be considered. Not within the 300 micron. This should be always outside 300 micron. The parameters is spot size should be 50 to 100 micron, which you can adjust with your state lamp setting. Exposure is 0.1 second or 100 milliseconds, and power you start with 100 milliwatt. You start with the lower side of the power where you can see the intensity of the one. Just you must get a whitening that is sufficient to obliterate the microaneurysm and ear mass. So before performing on the macular area, you can do one more thing for giving the laser. How to see what amount of whitening you are getting? You just give 2-3 test spots in the nasal cortex before going to the so that will save your high burn. Correctly treat all the focal leakage and irma. Location already discussed. You are not able, not required to go beyond the arcade. Just be 2 diameter inside the from the center of the macula. All those leaking points. Grid laser. You are performing use leakages and untreated laser.
Give him 1 minute, Mr. Coordinator, sir.
Chalo, chalo.
Treatment
Please give him. Yeah.
angle is allowed only if it remains more than 500 microns from the center. So parameter is second, the exposure time for the laser on the retina is 0.1 second, spot size 50 to 200 seconds. Start with the lower setting and gradually you can increase to achieve a light burn. Number of spots usually 100 to 200,
Yeah.
and distance between the two spot lasers should be 1 meter of the spot.
हाँ, सर.
So all the leakage area you have to cover.
यहाँ प्रैक्टिस कर रहा है तो हमने सबको सर involve किया.
Like here we have given the focal lasers, you can see in this, and the grid pattern is followed in the grid laser away from the center of the macula and in the edematous area only. Modified grids, again the grid plus focal. The millipulse treatment here, the main advantage of this is that you are giving a very light energy. You are inducing, there is no induction of the lethal gate buildup inside by the RPE cells, selectively absorbed by the RPE cells. Able to
I think Dr. Vinod, sum up, please.
Yes, sir. So here the important is the duration. You are giving for only 10 milliseconds. In grid and focal, you are giving for around 0.1 second. That is 100 milliseconds. Here the duration of laser on the retina is very less. So less destruction is there. So clinical principle is again focal and macular edema not involving the center.
Sum up, please.
Edema. The critical precaution what you should take, that is first your localization of the macula and the fovea should be very accurate to prevent the burn and prevent the and power should be adjusted according to the radial edema.
Thank you, Dr. Vinod Singh.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very well. Covered up as far the laser photocoagulation is concerned. Dr. Kamalji, is there the last
Yes,
speaker,
yes.
please?
Dr. Ashish is there, sir.
Isn't there, na? Not?
Yes, he's there. He'll join you.
Okay, you can invite them.
Okay,
Please.
Dr. Ashish Mitra is a profound comprehensive ophthalmologist, and as we have this meeting for comprehensive ophthalmologist, he is doing both anterior and posterior segment very well, and is master of both. So I invite him for his talk, please. You can share your screen.
No, Ashish, you are not audible.
Yeah, am I audible now?
Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. Thank you, Kamaljeet sir, for those kind words, and thank you, Professor Shrikant and Professor Kamaljeet sir, for giving me this opportunity. So I'll be talking about prophylactic lasers in retina more from a point of view of comprehensive, ophthalmologists, from general ophthalmologists, like what they should practice. So as we all know that the incidence of retinal detachment is in 1 in 10,000, and rhegmatogenous retinal detachment are the most common type of retinal detachment. So the risk factors being axial myopia, cataract surgery, probably where there is vitreous loss, vitreous prolapse, and surgery in younger patients, ocular trauma, a contralateral rhegmatogenous retinal detachment, and certain peripheral degeneration, especially the lattice degeneration. So what does literature has to add? What does literature says about the prophylaxis? So one of the recent studies published in Retinitis says about idiopathic GRTs, the incidence is decreased from 43% to 13 odd percent if you do a prophylactic laser 360 barrage in the fellow eye, and the macula on RD, the incidence reduces from 70 to 1.3 odd percent. So the relevant areas where the vitreous is particularly adherent is the vitreous base, the retinal vessels, certain degenerations like lattice degeneration, and these point of adhesions are most likely to cause retinal breaks during the pathological event, that is posterior vitreous detachment. So what is safe? What are asymptomatic breaks? These are the breaks like operculated and atrophic round holes. There is no vitreoretinal traction at the edge of these breaks. And in asymptomatic horseshoe-shaped retinal tears also, they just carry a risk of 5% to cause retinal detachment. So sometimes we do encounter asymptomatic detachments also. So the asymptomatic detachment, actually, the risk of progression to clinical detachment is 11 to 31%. And an equivalent percent of the asymptomatic detachment cases instead achieve spontaneous resolution before a clinical detachment occurs. So the idea is you could closely observe, or initially you can do a prophylactic treatment. For me, it would be a prophylactic treatment if there is a asymptomatic retinal detachment. So there are the ones which need treatment are the symptomatic breaks. These breaks are characterized by the perception of increased flashes and floaters, and they usually occur due to increased vitreoretinal traction during an acute episode of posterior vitreous detachment. Posterior vitreous detachment itself carries 10 to 20% risk overall of causing an acute break. The two important prognostic signs are pigmented cell or hemorrhage in the vitreous at the time of initial evaluation. And if there is a hemorrhage, there is an approximate 70% of these patients will have at least one retinal tear, and nearly 1/3 of these patients will have multiple breaks, and almost 90% of these tears are located superficially. So the denser the vitreous hemorrhage, the higher the likelihood of a retinal tear is present. And in the absence of vitreous pigmented cell or vitreous hemorrhage, the risk of retinal tear during a PVD is just 2 to 4%. And there is also a 2 to 5% risk of patients developing retinal break in the subsequent week. Symptomatic breaks are the ones which have a persistent vitreous traction at their edge and which denotes all tears, retinal dialysis, but it rarely includes operculated holes. They yield retinal detachment in 50% of the time, and when you do a later laser retinopexy, the risk is reduced to less than 5%. So this is important here. Now coming to one of the most specific peripheral degeneration, that is lattice degeneration, and this needs a special mention here because this is one which has a firm vitreous adhesion, and traction on these lesions typically produce retinal tears at the posterior lateral edges. So lattice degeneration is seen in 6 to 8% of the general population, and 30% of the rhegmatogenous retinal detachment occur in these eyes. Inversely, the lifetime risk of a retinal detachment in a patient with lattice is less than 1%. So lattice degeneration, it causes RD by two ways. Either there is a PVD or there isn't a PVD. So where there isn't a PVD, it's a progressive atrophy, and with PVD, so we'll come to this in the next slide. So progressive atrophy without PVD, it's the retinal hole may develop in as many as 35% of these lesions and tend to occur in young myopic. Localized retinal detachment, it occurs in 2% of the cases, and if they do become clinical, they expand relatively slowly. Though treatment is only warranted in cases of expanding retinal detachment, regular follow-up of all patients with such atrophic holes is critical. When it is with PVD, then these are the cases where you have to treat, because these are the patients where there is a traction is present. Or so what about the contralateral eye with lattice and with other eye has an RD? So lattice is present 45% in bilaterally, it is present in 45% of the patients, and the risk of detachment is present in the contralateral eye is 5%, which is as high as 25% in myopics, with prophylactic therapy reducing the risk by 3-fold. So to sum up, in lattice degeneration, indications for treatment of lattice is with tractional holes or break within it, symptomatic glasses where there is a flashes and floaters, RD in other eye, patient undergoing refractive procedures, and lattice with subclinical RD, even if pigmented and appears old, one-eyed patient, family history of RD, and atypical lattice degeneration. So there are certain lattices where you can observe when it is asymptomatic, when there are no breaks or holes with atrophic holes, when it is pigmented, but still there are no breaks or holes. So we have two modes of delivery. It's slit lamp and LIO to generate regions of confirmed chorioretinal adhesion. The idea is to counter vitreoretinal traction and prevent liquefied vitreous from passing into the subretinal space to generate a retinal detachment. So laser coagulation, photocoagulation, what we do is we make a 3 near confluent rows of laser. Among the strongest and therefore the most pathologic regions of vitreoretinal traction occur at the vitreous base, and far peripheral regions like they necessitate treatment to ora serrata, as the most common reason for treatment failure is insufficient laser placed around the anterior margin of these breaks. So laser photocoagulation, we have to titrate to yield moderately wide burns. Then there are certain conditions like media opacity, shallow retinal fluid, or relative paucity of RP and choroidal melanocytes, where you may necessitate use of higher power. And laser retinopexy is generally performed with a duration of 0.1 to 0.2 seconds, with shorter duration treatment requiring more powers. So longer exposure may be more effective in cases with media opacity or shallow SRF, and spot size also affects photocoagulation. Smaller spot size will yield a higher power per unit area than a larger spot size. Therefore, caution should be used to avoid rupture of Bruch's membrane. So with LIO, it is preferred for retinal tears which are there in the periphery. A disadvantage of this delivery system is the variability in the laser spot size, burn intensity, delivery location, all inherent qualities of delivery system where the laser lens target are independently mobile and unfixed. And spot size also increases as the power of hand and lens increases and more hyperopic the patient is. And scleral depression also decreases the spot size by bringing the target tissue closer to the laser source and focusing the lens. So I'll skip this. Now slit lamp, it is there for patients with mid-peripheral tears in whom positioning at the slit lamp is preferred. High power contact plus contact lens can provide a view of area necessitating treatment, while also offering stabilization of the patient's eye. This provides a real inverted images, and these lenses often modify the laser spot size, and therefore actual area of photocoagulation of the retina is increased. So for tears, further anteriorly, some physicians preferred mirrored negative power plano-concave lens. Such negative power lenses create virtual erect images, and patient cooperation can further assist visualization of the retina with the patient looking away from a given mirror, providing a more anterior view. I'll just sum up. So the complications are inadvertent laser to the macula, choroidal effusion, epiretinal membrane, hemorrhage of the retina, vitreous and choroid, choroidal neovascular membrane, and formation of new retinal breaks. Follow-up is important, and where you find the treatment is inadequate, you always have to go for retreatment. And my take-home message is that it is easy to learn and do more. It is important that indication should not be missed, and people doing medical retina, they do lasers at time. And in case of any doubt, do not hesitate to seek an advice from your vitreoretinal friend. Thank you for your patience listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ashish Mitra, for such an excellent talk that you have given on this important topic, which many a times comprehensive ophthalmologists, they are these days having their machines available in their clinics. Everybody is today having OCT, fundus camera, and indirect ophthalmoscopy and laser, etc. And so today, what I think, Professor Shrikant, is that the ophthalmologist should be well versed with cataract, glaucoma, medical retina,
Yes, very
and
right.
and myopia also, which is very important today. So we were discussing this in the morning with you. So what are your final comments, sir? We have 15 minutes and we have Professor Dwivedi with us.
Wow,
And I
wonderful.
will request him to...
Hello, Dwivedi, how are you, sir?
Hello, I'm fine. I
Very nice
congratulate.
talking to you all the time.
I congratulate Dr.
Always,
Shrikant
always.
and Dr. Kamaljeet for organizing such a nice instructional course. I have a long association with Dr. Shrikant, more than 30-40 years. And we know
Yes,
in
sir,
the
very
Varanasi,
nice.
you have established the interest of postgraduates in the retina. Dr. Kamaljeet Singh is also doing an excellent job in
Excellent.
Allahabad. He
Undoubtedly.
is a real retinal surgeon. I know from the beginning, he is very much interested in the retina, and he used to discuss day-to-day problems, medical problems of the retina And this is a very interesting talk in the laser in ophthalmology, particularly when we see for the diabetes, diabetic retinopathy is a really a challenge. And particularly for this poor area where we are seeing the number of patients and they are not taking care of them. I am having for more than 40, 50 years of practice and really get depressed when they are not taking care of their retina. So such type of instructional course organized by our basic comprehensive ophthalmologist, Dr. Srikant and Dr. Kamalji, I congratulate. Dr.
Thank you,
Mitra,
Dr.
I also appreciate you. You have done a very good job in the Chitrakoot, and I believe in coming years you will do very good in the retina. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you, doctor, for kind words.
We
Few things
have
are very important as for the comprehensive ophthalmology. I think, Kamalji, let me sum up for important
yes,
because
sir,
you
yes.
are very important of you. Instead of getting lost with the DRS studies, DCCCT is concerned, the ICO guidelines are very clear in their opinion as far the setup is concerned, because we are talking about the comprehensive ophthalmology. They have mentioned that in a higher setup, in a lower setup, still you can render the results and can give treatment to these patients. So these ICO guidelines are published and may be available on website also. Dr. Kamaljeet Singh has very well enumerated these with it, and this ICO guidelines are of much practical values or practical value as far the our scenario is concerned, because even if although it is being taken up by the International Council of Ophthalmologists, they have come up with the idea that what is there for the setup, which is for poorer or higher setup or lower setup. That means that lower setup doesn't mean keep providing lower low quality work. It is a lower setup where we can still render the results and give benefit to the patients. That is very important. So the talk of Dr. Kamaljeet Singh was mean having a wearing this and making the things more clearer as far the setup is concerned. One should not feel sorry about it that if he is not having OCT, he cannot see the cases of diabetic retinopathy. You can still see the cases of diabetic retinopathy, can send if required, send the higher centers for OCT if required for.
some questions for the speakers. One is, in a case of diabetic retinopathy, Dr. Abhishek, when do you want to do vitreoretinal surgery? What is your indication?
Abhishek.
Yes, sir. Sir, firstly, when we go to the advanced PDR where tractions start to come and there is a fibrovascular proliferation at the disc, and at that point of time, if you can do a PRP and silent it out, then it's fine. But sometimes it aggravates the traction also. And putting an anti-VEGF also increases the traction that is there on the retina. So that is the time we should intervene surgically and make sure that the traction is taken care at the onset only. Because once the traction increases, it makes our job even more difficult to get rid of the traction when we are peeling the membranes. So the sooner the better, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Abhishek, but I'm confused rather. On the other hand, they say that if membranes are there,
yes,
in
sir.
a case of diabetic retinopathy, before planning for advanced vitrectomy, one should inject the anti-VEGF. That facilitates your surgical procedures. Let it happen
only
retinal detachment occur, because retinal detachment is not the worrisome thing. It is the iatrogenic hemorrhages or during the procedure uncontrolled hemorrhage is the biggest problem.
No, sir. That is actually the anti-VEGF is given 3-4 days before the surgery. It will only help you during the surgery that it doesn't bleed so much.
Yes.
But other than that, giving a monthly injection, giving the injection
I'm not
to
talking
reduce
monthly. I'm talking about this diabetic retinopathy where you want to go for.
Yeah. That before a surgery, we give an anti-VEGF and then go for surgery after 3 days.
Fine.
Even if fraction RD has occurred, doesn't bother.
Now, may I, Dr. Ashish, what do you have plan in your mind in a patient who is diabetic and is having cataract? How do you go about?
If the patient is having cataract and if I can evaluate his macula, if it is a dry macula, so probably I will go only for cataract surgery, but counsel him that he has got more chances that he might develop diabetic macular edema, more chances. But if in case he has some amount of diabetic macular edema also, so I'll combine the surgery with anti-VEGF. And this is a well-known fact also. We have seen in several presentations also that diabetic surgery also does accelerate some amount of retinopathy as well. So it causes a little bit of inflammation and all, and it does accelerate some amount of retinopathy as well.
Thank you. Dr. Vinod.
Yes, sir. So
can
I think
see
you have done so these cases combined intravitreal Amsolon and cataract surgery. The research has been done by under your guidance here.
Yes. What is the role of intravitreal triamcinolone in present day scenario?
Yeah, it's working, sir. It's good because we don't have all the patients like in our settings. We are working in the government hospital. We don't have money for anti-VEGF, so it's good to give a intravitreal triamcinolone, and we have a good result with the intravitreal triamcinolone rather than leaving like that and sending them somewhere for the anti-VEGF. It's good, sir. We have got a good result here. We are doing all the time.
Dr. Pranav, when do you do B scans in your cases of BRVO?
Sir, if there is vitreous hemorrhage, then only we go for if the view is not clear. And otherwise.
Speak loudly, please. I cannot hear you.
Hello.
Yes.
I'm saying that when there is vitreous hemorrhage due to neovascularization, where we cannot view the retina, then we go for B scan. Otherwise, I don't think there's a necessity of going for a B scan and BRVO.
How do you see, Dr. Abhishek, how do you see neovascularization in the angle? And how do you think that NVI comes? It comes on the iris first or on the angle?
Sir, it will either come on the pupillary margin at the frill, or it will come at the angle also. Okay. So when it is there at the angle, it will be a zipper-like fashion. So you can see at some points the angle is getting closed and then it's open after a point. So that clinches the diagnosis.
So usually we suggest that in any case of CRVO, one must examine the pupil without dilating first, and then you should dilate later, because in pupillary margin you can get neovascularization, and many a time we miss, which increases and causes neovascular glaucoma.
Correct.
Okay. Sir, Dr. Shrikant, sir.
Sir.
What do you do in prophylactic laser in myopia? When do you do?
In
prophylactic laser in myopic fundus?
Yeah, one should be very cautious because you can end up with iatrogenic retinal detachments also. So as Ashish Mitra has found out, not all it's not as if previously it was thought that in case if you are seeing the lattice, that doesn't mean you should go for prophylactic laser in each and every cases, because in neuroptoxicity studies, they were found that in about 18% of cases, lattice is present, but there was no retinal detachment. So not all this, but in case if you are doing, one should be very, very cautious about it. And you should cover the lattice very well, not as if it is laser should be equidistant. It should be your same spot very well the lattice, so that you should not land up into the problem.
Dr. Malika, we have some time, the coordinator?
Yes, doctor. Yes,
we have some time for 10 minutes, I think.
Yeah, you still have 7 minutes at least.
7 minutes, okay. Yeah. So we'll continue. I find Dr. Malika Goel has also joined. They are also retina specialists. Shobit is also there on the other side. Yeah, we are talking about lasers for the comprehensive ophthalmologists. Okay. So, sir, in exact indication of lasers in myopic fundus, I would ask whether if you get a hole or two while you are doing indirect ophthalmoscopy, should you do laser or not? That is my question, Ashish.
Yeah, Dr. Shobit, you want to take the question?
Yes, you can tell. Yes.
Okay. Shobit, are you there? Okay, I'll speak. See, any case of myopia with a break, definitely we should treat, because if it is a high myopia, anything more than 4 or 6, as it is, they are predisposed to detachment. So if I see a few breaks or even a single break in a myope, definitely we should laser. But if they are extensive lattice, then as somebody's just pointed out, that could be counterproductive. So there you have to do very mild laser. But yes, I would do it. But aggressive laser can precipitate an RD if it is very extensive lesions. But for occasional lesions, we should treat.
But would you consider lasering an operculated hole also if you get in myopics?
Absolutely, absolutely. Operculated does not mean there is any safety, because the vitreous is still more liquefied in a myope than in a non-myope. It will go through an operculated break. Operculation simply means that there is no traction on the retinal area, but that doesn't mean the vitreous cannot go through the hole.
Shobit, what is the role of cryo in these days of availability of such
I wouldn't
lasers?
do cryo. I only do cryo where I'm not able to do a laser because of some factor. If I am doing a surgery and I find there is extensive chorioretinal atrophy and there is a break on it and I'm not able to achieve laser, that's where I use cryo. I just wanted to point out one thing. If I have a healthy patient, just a scenario, -3 myopia, very healthy gel vitreous, and if there are lamellar breaks in lattices, I would just observe. But at the same time, as Dr. Malika said, if it's a full thickness hole and if the myopia is above -4 in the range -4 to -8, these are higher risk eyes for retinal detachment, I would definitely laser. But I'm a little more conservative about laser photocoagulation, where the patient's activities don't dictate, there is no family history of retinal detachment, and the vitreous is very healthy.
Thank you, Dr. Shobit. Dr. Abhishek, what do you do for a flat neovascularization on the retina and a neovascularization which is coming onto the vitreous? Abhishek?
Yes, sir. Sir, definitely, if it is coming into the vitreous, it's aggressive NVE, and we have to do a PRP as soon as possible. A flat NVE may be a regressing NVE, and we can wait and give it some time. But mostly a NVE is a NVE, whether flat or raised. We have to do a PRP and look for the ischemic areas on a FFA, and then accordingly do a laser. These days, with the wide field angiographies, we can see the CNP areas very clearly, and we make sure that our PRP is targeted on those areas only.
Dr. Ashish, can we directly laser the flat NVEs on the retina or not?
Ideally, one should avoid directly lasering the flat NVs because there is a risk. They carry a risk of like bleed also. But PRP is must for these patients, because in Indian scenarios we never know that this patient will turn up next or not. So for them, you have to counsel, you have to treat them, and even in cases like in Chitrakoot, in cases where one eye had PDR and other eye had very severe NPDR, even these patients we used to do PRP because the follow-up was an issue with these patients in our scenario.
Professor Shrikant, is not subsiding.
With all due respect,
How do you
sir, we have,
laser further?
Kamaljeet sir,
Kamil-
with all due
I'm really
respect,
Just
sorry,
last
but-
question, last question.
okay, sir.
Bolo
Sir,
Kamalji.
actually, we've already
Yes,
crossed
last
our
question, you
timing,
answer
sir.
it, please, sir.
Okay, we are just finishing. We are just packing up.
Okay, sir.
If the neovascularization is not regressing, you are going to do a further augmentation of laser. How
Yes.
do you set your laser settings then?
Laser settings augmentation is wherever it is not done properly, because many times the spot size are varying from this. So you should arrange in between wherever the laser is not there, and it should cover enough so that neovascularization is stopped or something.
So thank you so much, Professor Shrikant, Dr. Ashish, Dr. Abhishek, Dr. Vinod, Dr. Pranav. and our guest speakers, Dr. Malika Goel and Shobhit Chawla.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining
Thank
us.
you, sir.
Thanks a
Thank you,
lot.
Kamaljeet.
Thank
You are
you.
very instrumental as far as genesis and
Thank you.
finalization of this very instruction course is concerned. Hats off to you. Thank you once again, Dr. Kamaljeet Singh.
Thank you
Thank
so
you.
much. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.